Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today we're going to be taking a look at the TP-Link Omada AX1800 Wi-Fi 6 access point and how to set it up for the first time. Now, full disclosure, TP-Link did send me this sample unit for me to make some videos on, such as this one, how to set it up. I'm also going to be making some other videos on it, like a full review or advanced features deep dive, but for this one here, I'm just going to keep it simple to setting it up for the first time, much in the same way as a Unify access point, which if you're subscribed to this channel, you already know that most of the stuff I deal with is Ubiquiti or Unify equipment, and this is very similar, and it's very much in the same realm as that. So without going too much into it, let's go ahead and get this out of the box here. And I have opened this before, so not all of the packaging is going to be here already. I've been using this in my home network for about 3 weeks now, just kind of putting it through the paces, seeing what it can do and all that. But this is what you get in the box. You got the access point itself, which is, I think, a pretty decent size. It's not very big at all. There's not really a whole lot going on with it. You also get the hardware mount to mount it to either the ceiling or the wall or whatever you want. And the cool thing about the mount is that it actually has a legend for the different holes and what they are meant to match up with. So we've got our ceiling wall mount for A, which is just a square of screws basically. We've got B, which is for a standard 3.5 inch round junction box. And then we've got C and D, which is for a single gang outlet box, either US or EU standard. So that's pretty cool. And to attach that to the back of the access point, you basically just screw that to the wall, ceiling, whatever you want. There is an arrow on the access point, much like a Unify device, basically pointing to here. And on the mount, there is a notch up here, and we're basically lining that up with the clip that this arrow is pointing to. And you can pretty much see how this is going to work. You've got a notch down here that's going to go over to lock it in place, and if you just twist, then that is what locks the access point. Now, the good thing about this mount is that there is no pinhole to try and release it. It's really just you twist and it comes off. So it's not a pain to put on, and it's not even a pain to take off. There's nothing special. It just twists once it's on there. Now, the other stuff we get in the box is quite a lot of hardware. We've got some washers, some butterfly screws, and some long bolts as well. And also these screws that I'm kind of unsure what they do. And then obviously our drywall anchors and our actual screws. Now, the last thing in the box is the power supply. So if we're relating this to Ubiquiti again, you do not get a power injector with this. You actually get a power brick, and it's a 12 volt 1.5 amp that plugs directly into the access point. Now, because of this, you're probably going to want to invest in some sort of either power injector or a switch. Personally, I'm not a big fan of having power bricks on my access points, but that's there if you need that option. And then, of course, we have the quick installation guide, which we'll probably be using to set this up. Let's just go ahead and open it. We've got our important information like the LED indicator on the front panel, flashes twice after initialization is completed, flashes once while upgrading, and it flashes quickly if you're resetting it. Now, it'll flash slowly if it's isolated, and if you have the locate feature on, it'll flash quickly to locate and identify the device. And then it goes over the mounting instructions for ceiling, wall, junction box, etc. Gives you an overview of all the hardware, which we just took a look at. And that's pretty much all those other pages are. So let's take a look at the power supply. So it says it's compliant with 802.3 AT power over Ethernet. So that is what you want to make sure your switch supports if you're using this with a PoE switch. But also at the same time, if you have any power injectors lying around that support that version of PoE, you can use that to power this access point as well, so you don't have to use that external power supply brick. And then the rest of this is how to configure it in the controller, which we will get to in just a minute. So before we head off and start configuring the controller and getting this all ready to go, Let's take a look at the ports we have back here. There's only the 3, and they're pretty self-explanatory. You got your Ethernet, which is power over Ethernet in, your power supply connector, and then obviously your reset button, which you can hold down with a paper clip. I still got my trusty paper clip right here. And that is how you would reset the device to factory default settings. Now let's go ahead and plug this up and get it booted so that we're ready to actually configure it. It is the exact same concept as a UniFi device if you're familiar with them. This is part of TP-Link's Omada platform, which is an SDN platform. So it does use a controller, exactly the same premise as UniFi equipment. So the configurations are typically not done on this device. The TP-Link actually has the option to log in like it's a standalone device, much like you would set up any other router or access point that you pick up off the shelf. So this, in contrast to UniFi devices, actually has that option, but the Omada controller is the way it's really meant to be configured. And we're going to be going through all of the different ways that we can configure it, just standalone on the access point itself, using their mobile app, and using the actual Omada full-blown controller. And they also offer a standalone hardware version of this controller, so you do have the option to actually buy a separate hardware device already running the controller software. And that's this right here. This is one of the 2 or 3 different versions, I think. This is the OC200. There is a bigger, more powerful version, and really the only difference is the power that's in that box and the ability to control more and more TP-Link devices with it. But that will have its own separate video. So let's go ahead and just hook it up here. I'm just connecting it to my desktop switch, which does support power over Ethernet. So once we plug it in, I'll go ahead and shut the lights off and we can watch the LED do its thing. So here we go. We've got this blue light, just flashes a couple times and then goes solid. And as far as I'm aware, this is all that happens. So right now it's booting up, it's doing whatever it's got to do in the background. It's not really giving us any indication at all of what it's doing. However, now that it's connected, we should be able to see it either by directly browsing to its web page, which to do that we have to figure out what IP it grabbed. This does have a fallback IP address, which it will default to if it cannot grab an address via DHCP. If it does grab an address in DHCP, you basically have to consult your DHCP server, see which address it grabbed, and then browse to that device. And again, that's for standalone setup. If you're using the controller, it should automatically find it as long as this is on the same network as the controller installation. So let's go ahead and get into the configuration. First, we're just going to do standalone mode just to show you that, and then afterwards, we'll hit up the other 2 options as well. Okay, so the first method of setup we're going to go through is just browsing to the access point itself. Like I said, we have to find out what IP it grabbed or go to the fallback IP. And off of the top of my head, I don't remember what the fallback IP is, but once we get into either the device setup screen or the controller, it actually does tell us what that fallback IP would be if we do need it. So I'm not holding that information from you, I just cannot remember at this point. So let's go ahead and open up a web browser, and for me, I'm using a Ubiquiti Edge router, surprise, surprise, so I'm going to browse to that and log in to see my DHCP leases. However you would find your DHCP leases on your equipment is pretty much specific to you, unless you are running an Edge router just like me. So in my DHCP lease table, I have found the access point. Basically, you have to look for the model of it. So it's an EAP 610 and then the MAC address of the device, which is also located on the back of the access point on the sticker if you are wanting to directly compare those. Now, the IP that it got was 10.88.13.108. So let's just open up another tab, 10.88.13.108, hit enter, and we get a login page to our EAP 610. And the default username and password here is just admin, and then it asks you to set up a new account. So we're gonna just keep the same username as admin, but we're gonna give it a new password. And I think password 1234 will be good for us right now. password 1234, and we're going to click next. Now here we're just going to set up our basic wireless settings. So we can enable or disable 2.4 and 5 depending on what we want. I'm just going to leave both of those enabled, and I'm going to call this Toasties TP-Link for our SSID, and give it a password of password 1234 again. Now obviously don't follow my lead on the password creation here. You're going to want something a little more secure on both your wireless network and your actual wireless access point. And I'm just going to fill out the same thing for the 5 gigahertz and click save. And it's going to apply those settings to the access point. And once that's done, it's going to ask you to connect to the new wireless network. It's not going to let you continue unless you check that you've connected to it. So I'm just going to check that box and hit finish. Technically, I have not actually connected to that network, but it doesn't really matter. It just wants you to confirm you've connected before you proceed. Now, once we have finished, we get this menu. It shows us all of our general information here, the device name, model, yada yada. If we go to the wireless tab here, we've got our 2 wireless networks, Toasties TP-Link and Toasties TP-Link for both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. And then we have our radio settings that we can view. We're on channel 11 for 2.4 and 149 for 5. Channel width is 20 and 40 for 2.4 and 2040-80 for 5. And then we have our different statistics for radio traffic and LAN traffic. Now, if we go to the client tab, we can see whoever's connected to our access point. So I'll just go ahead and connect my phone up. So I'm heading to my wireless settings on my iPhone. I can see my network Toasties TP-Link. I'm going to go ahead and select that and enter password 1234. And then I'm going to click join. And my remote phone display has frozen and crashed because I was switching wireless networks. So I just got my phone to connect back, and we are connected to Toasties TP-Link, and because I'm able to actually connect to my phone, that tells me that it is working. Obviously you're not going to have that kind of verification because you're probably not recording your iPhone screen while you're doing this. So let's go ahead and go back into the access point client portal, and we can see we've got 2 entries now. I'm going to go ahead and refresh that just in case that's not accurate. Looks like it is. But we have an entry for both the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz band. I'm not exactly sure why the Macs are entirely different, but once we have these entries in the table here, we have a couple options we can do. We can either block them entirely from using the network, or we can rate limit them. So if we want to enable a rate limit, we just put a download or an upload limit, select if we want it in kilobits or megabits, and then boom, they're limited. Now, aside from this, let's go ahead and take a look at the other menus just here in the access point itself, and that is the wireless menu, which we have most of the same settings that we had in the status area, except for here we can actually change them instead of just view them. So we can change the wireless mode, the channel width, the channel, etc. If we go over to the portal, this is where you can have kind of a guest portal set up. That is going to be beyond the scope of this video, but hopefully I'll be making another video in the future on this part. And then also the VLAN IDs. Right now they're disabled by default. We can enable a VLAN ID and assign that to one or both of our wireless networks. For now, we are not going to worry about that at all. MAC filtering, that's pretty self-explanatory. If you've used access points before, you just put in the MAC addresses you either want to explicitly allow or deny, and then that can filter the devices from either being able or not being able to use the network. We got a scheduler, which just can set time limits basically, or certain time spans that this SSID is going to be active for. For that, we have to create a profile. I'm also not going to go into this, but it is there for you to configure. And then we have band steering, which is a little bit more of an advanced feature, but it is present on a lot of access points. It is disabled by default. Typically, I leave it disabled unless I really have some sort of need for it. It does note that if we want to run band steering, we do have to have the exact same SSID on both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. And to make sure that everything about them is the same, the name, the security mode, and the password. So we could enable this right now if we want, because that applies to both of our networks, but we're not going to worry about it. We can go over to QoS. Right now it is enabled by default, but we can change these more granular settings if we want. We also have rogue AP detection, which is pretty much just going to tell us if there's any neighboring access points with the exact same SSID as ours, which we may or may not want broadcasting our SSID. Now moving on to management. This is basically access point specific configurations. So like the IP address of the access point itself. Here is that fallback IP that I was talking about. So 192.168.0.254 would be the IP address of the device if it did not grab one using DHCP. So while it doesn't list the actual IP address that it has right now, we do have our IP setting to dynamic, which means it's using DHCP, and it got our DHCP address, which is how we are managing it. Now we can switch that over to static and give it to whatever IP address we want to statically assign to it. I'm just going to leave mine on DHCP. Now the rest of these is like the system log. We can take a look through the logs. We can change the web server port for this configuration. One of the important settings actually is this layer 3 accessibility. If this is not enabled, you will not be able to manage this access point from outside of this network. And what I mean by that is if you are running multiple networks inside your home or your business, say for example this one got a 10.88.13.108 IP. If this is your home network, you're probably not running more than one, but if you are, like I am, then if I try to browse to this 108 IP to configure my access point from say my 10.88.88 network, I won't get the page because this is not enabled. And I can show you here real quick what I mean, because I have my server pulled up, and if I try to browse 10.88.13.108 and I hit enter, I don't get the page. But if we go back to this and I enable layer 3 accessibility and I hit save, those options have been saved, and then I go back here, now I'm able to access the login page, and that is because the IP address of this server that I'm currently on is outside of the 10.88.13 network. So that's an interesting and also very important setting to not overlook, especially if you have multiple networks and you want to be able to access the configuration page from those. Now, it is disabled by default for security because usually these are on the one internal network, and your other networks, you typically don't want other people being able to access it from those. But let's go ahead and move on to management access. This is just locking down this interface even further with MAC authentication. We can add in specific MAC addresses that we want to be able to access the management interface, and we can also assign the management to only a certain VLAN. I'm not going to do either of these. They're outside the scope of this video, so I'm going to move on to LED control. We can either turn it on or off. We can hit locate. All that does is flash the LED on the front so that if you have multiple of these devices and you're trying to relay to some technician to work on one of them, which one you're actually talking about, you can hit this and it'll flash the LED for them. And then we've got SSH, whether or not we want to enable it, and if we want to enable it over layer 3 again. And then the same goes for SNMP if we want to enable that or disable that. Now moving on to the last section, that is system. We can change our account username and password. In the controller settings area, we can enable cloud-based controller management if we want to. This is done using a TP-Link account, much the same as a Unify account and remote access in that realm if you're familiar. And we can also update the controller inform URL right here. Now, this isn't a setting that is needed for this standalone setup, but here in a minute when we actually install controller software, this is where we can manually point it to an IP address if for some reason it's not being automatically discovered by our controller. And also where this is helpful is if we are on another network than our controller is located on. We're going to have to go in here and manually point this access point to the controller on another network, because our controller is not going to be able to discover these devices if they aren't on the same local network as the controller. And that is where this setting would come in. We would manually put in the IP of our controller. Now, in this video, we haven't set one of those up, so we're going to ignore that for now. And then the rest of these are pretty self-explanatory. You got your time settings, your reboot or factory reset button, backup and restore if we have previous configuration files that we want to restore to this access point, and also the firmware update. Now this is a manual firmware update. We have to download this file from TP-Link and update it here. But hopefully I wasn't going too fast through all that, because this is just the first way to set this access point up, and that is browsing directly to it and going through all of these menus, which really didn't take any time at all. But we're going to move on now. Actually, I'm going to reset this. So I'm going to go to the Reboot and Reset tab, and I'm going to reset this to factory defaults so we can go ahead and set it up again using our TP-Link mobile app. All right, and actually I changed my mind. I'm not sure how obvious it's going to be, but I actually recorded the previous like 25 minutes of this video probably months ago, and here I am trying to finish it out. I'm just going to make one quick change, and that is I'm going to do the mobile app setup in a separate video. And the only reason I'm doing that is because I've had some technical difficulties with my iPhone screen mirroring, and me just trying to record the face of my phone, I wasn't happy with it. So I'll be doing that in another video. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the actual controller setup. So this is probably going to be how you're going to set this up. You're going to use a software controller installed somewhere that may or may not be powered on all the time. It doesn't have to be, but if you want to collect statistics and all that, it does need to be. But we're going to download that controller software, install it, and adopt this access point to it. And if you, again, are familiar with UniFi, this is going to be basically the exact same process. The only thing different is the brand of controller and interface that we're going to be dealing with. So let's just go ahead and Google download TP-Link Omada controller, and we're going to follow this first link to TP-Link's support, and this is what we're looking for. So the version, we want the latest one. There are guides on how to step them up between the different versions, but since we're setting it up from scratch, we're just going to go with the latest, and we're looking for the controller software. You can also watch the setup video if you'd like, but we're just going to go ahead and click download right here. So here it just gives you a little pop-up that's like, hey, if you're going to upgrade, you probably need to read this, because there are some different procedures for upgrading from an older version. You can see right here in red, if you're planning to upgrade to this version from an old controller and it says version 3.217 or below, then you need to read that, because there are some different steps you need to take if you're upgrading. But like I said, we don't care because we're setting it up from scratch. We can go ahead and exit out of that for now, go to our downloads folder, and extract this archive. So extract files, okay. Then we're going to open that folder that it just made and double click on Omada controller. And then we'll hit next, next, install. And we're going to leave start Omada controller after installation checked so that we can just go ahead and get it going. And I'll go ahead and minimize out of that. And here we go, we're initializing. It's going to start the database and all that. And after it's gone through all that, you can see it automatically popped up our web page here. If you do actually exit out of that, all you got to do is hit launch to get it back. And we'll go ahead and ignore this certificate warning because it's its own self-signed. And we're greeted with the main setup wizard. So let's go ahead, click let's get started. We're going to give our controller a name, so we'll just say Toasties controller. Select region, yep, I'm in the United States. Time zone, I am central. I'm not sure if I said this in the first part of the video, but I don't know really the difference between these. Just kind of guessing, I would say like a hotel, it might tune some things for a lot of access points spread out over an area. Restaurant, it might tune it for higher density or something. Office, I'm not sure. The only thing I can really tell from these is just kind of some of these are more of a higher dense situation, and some of them usually require a lot more access points than others, but I don't actually know what it does behind the scenes when you select these. So I usually just leave it on hotel. And I'll go ahead and agree for the cookies to get that out of the way. We can also make a customized one. Actually, I hadn't seen that before. So maybe we'll just make that custom one and call it Toast House. Again, I don't know what any of these do, so I don't know what that's going to affect down the line. And now it brings us to configuring devices, and I do have that one that is out there on the network. I'm not really sure why it's not showing up here, so we're going to skip that for now. And it's going to take us to configure WAN settings and overrides. Now, we're not setting up a gateway or router or anything like that. That is a different device, which we'll cover in a different video. So I'm just going to skip that section entirely since it doesn't matter for the access point. And then we get to configure wireless. Now I can skip that and set it up later, but I'm just going to go ahead and configure it. So we're going to call the network name Toasties Wi-Fi and just give it a password of, and if we check guest Wi-Fi, we can go ahead and just set up one that's designated for guests out of the box. I'm just going to go ahead and set it up because I'm a little curious on how that's going to work, but most of the time you're probably just going to leave that unchecked. We're going to go ahead and click next, and now we enter that controller access page. So we're going to set up our administrator account. I'm just going to call mine admin. Not really sure if we have to have an email, so I'm going to skip it for now and see if it yells at me. Give the controller a password. And for device account, this is going to be the account that kind of logs into your devices. So if you did set the access point up in standalone mode and change the username and password to log into it, then you would probably want to put that in here. But since we didn't do that, we're just going to use the default login for the access point standalone setup, which should just be admin. And then we got cloud access. This is where if you have a TP-Link ID, you can tie it to that and actually manage this controller from the cloud. Your controller does not move into the cloud. You just simply use your TP-Link account, sign in to TP-Link's website, and then you can access your controller remotely. The controller we're setting up here is going to talk to the TP-Link cloud, and you can log in and use it from either of those. I like to just keep that off. That's a personal preference for me. But if you do have that account set up and you want to manage it from the cloud, by all means, keep that enabled. Just put in your TP-Link ID and password. Now we got to accept the terms. And I am not going to join the experience improvement program. So I'm just going to click next. And here's the summary. So we're setting up the Toasties controller. The application scenario is Toast House, which does I don't know what. And we're going to have a wireless network called Toasties Wi-Fi and a guest network called Toasties Guest. And our administrator name is admin, and I just put our password as password. So we'll go ahead and finish, and that's going to configure our controller and throw us to the login page. So let's go ahead and log in with admin and the password we set, and it's going to throw us right into a tutorial. You can go through that if you want to learn a little bit more. It actually is really useful if you've never used this before, but I'm just going to go ahead and exit out of it. So you can kind of see this interface has a little bit of similarities to another one, but there are quite a few differences. So let's go ahead and go to our EAP section to look for our AP. Now we don't have any devices found. So really what I'm going to do here is just check my IP address. So I'm going to open command prompt, ipconfig, just make sure that I'm on the same network that I've put my access point on, and I am. So what I'm going to do real quick, since it's not showing up, is just go reset it one more time by holding a paperclip in the back. All right, and here we go. It is showing up now. The problem I had was I had plugged it into a port on my switch that had the wrong VLAN. So basically I connected this access point to an entirely different network and was trying to get it to work. So that's what happens if you don't connect your access point to the same network as the machine running the controller. It will just not find it, at least not without some custom configuration, but that's for another time. So now that we are seeing our device, all we got to do is click on it here in the controller and click adopt. And since we already set up that Toasties Wi-Fi and the Toasties guest network in this controller, it should by default push those configurations to this access point once we adopt it. So let's go ahead and bring up our wireless network list on our phone and see if we can see it. And yep, there we are, Toasties Wi-Fi and Toasties Guest. So let's go ahead and connect to Toasties Wi-Fi. Should prompt us for a password. And it actually didn't, so that might be a setting we need to look at. It also kicked me from my remote session because I switched over to a different network. Actually, never mind, there it goes. It just took it a second to reconnect. So that at least tells me our local wireless network is working because I am able to use this remote screen app. Let's just go ahead and run a speed test, but just the fact that I was able to get to a speed test shows me that it's working anyway. So let's go ahead and forget about the wireless network here for a second and take a look at the settings we have. Now to go to the overall controller settings for the wireless, we got to go down here to the bottom to settings. And we can tweak our wireless networks here on the left. So go to WLAN, you can see we have the two, Toasties Wi-Fi and Toasties Guest, both of them using all three of these bands here. Go ahead and click out of that. So if I go to the edit button here on the side for Toasties Wi-Fi, we actually do have a security key. I imagine that since I probably reused that SSID and used the same password on it, that's probably why it didn't prompt me for one. I was just a little worried that it was going to be an open network even though I set a password on it, but that's not the case. I'm sure my phone just had that cached. But here we can also edit pretty much all the other settings that we want. And for the most part, I'm really not going to worry about any of them. I do like to use data control. We'll get into that if I ever make an optimization video though, because basically I don't want to change any of these settings unless I am experiencing problems, and then those problems are going to determine what settings I'm even going to look at here. So the only setting that I'm really concerned with is just this whole section up here for the name, the bands, whether or not it's a guest network, security, and security key. And if I do want it to use a VLAN, then I'm going to worry about this checkbox here. So if we do want this SSID on another VLAN other than one, we are going to have to check that box and put in the VLAN ID that we want. But for now, we are good. We'll go ahead and cancel out of that. And that's really all you need to get this set up for a wireless network. Now, of course, you can see on the left here, there's a whole lot of other settings in this controller because it's built for the Omada device line. So we can have switches, we can have routers, and we can have access points in here all together managed by one controller. But since this video was just how to set up the access point portion, we don't have to worry about any of that, and none of those settings really apply here. So hopefully that showed you everything you need to know to get these off the ground and running. In this video, we just went over how to set it up in standalone mode, which again is a very nice feature to have. Just browse directly to the access point, put in your settings like you would a regular off-the-shelf access point. And then we went ahead and installed the Omada controller, which is, again, if you're familiar with Unified Controller, basically the exact same thing, just a different device line from a different manufacturer. Now, I am going to make another video on the mobile app. I just had too many problems. It was taking me too long to figure out how to record that process. Basically, it wasn't really anything to do with the access point not working properly. It was more me just getting annoyed with having to connect and reconnect my remote screen. So once I find a really good method of recording that, then I'll upload that video. And I also plan to do a video on actually connecting this to the TP-Link cloud, if that's something you're into. But as always, I hope you learned something, and also as always, happy networking.